I'm Mr. eTutor, your mystery tutor here at mysterytutor.com, and welcome to video module 11-4. In this module, we'll be talking about the best way to attack the literature subject test. As I mentioned in an earlier module, the questions that appear on the literature subject test are essentially the same as the questions that appear in the passage-based reading part of the critical reading section on the SAT-1. And here's what I mean by that. On the SAT-1 critical reading section, the key thing that most students never figure out is that in order to answer the questions with complete confidence and with mechanical precision, you have to recognize that you must not do any reading between the lines or interpreting or anything subjective like that when you try to analyze the question and the passage. Instead, the key to the SAT-1 critical reading is looking for the answer choice that restates the key idea from the key portion of the text. Once you learn to do that, you'll probably find that the critical reading section of the SAT-1 becomes much, much easier. Well, the same thing applies here on the literature subject test. On this test, for every single question, you're going to look for the answer choice that has complete and full word-by-word or line-by-line support within the relevant portion of the passage. So that part probably sounds easy enough. But it actually gets a little bit harder on the literature section for a couple of reasons. First of all, the individual passages that can appear on the literature section will be far more sophisticated than the ones that can appear on the SAT-1 critical reading. You're going to see things like poems and scripts from plays. You're going to see stories and essays that were written centuries ago, and all of these things are harder to read and harder to understand than the passages that can appear on the SAT-1. So in that respect, the literature test is a little bit more challenging. For instance, you're going to have to get used to things like archaic language or extremely long sentences or poetry lines or things of that nature. But if you can get past this, you're going to see that on the literature test, just like on the SAT-1 critical reading test, the correct answer to each question will restate the ideas that appeared within the passage. It will always be like this, no matter how hard it is to understand what the passage says, or how hard it is to read the poem, or whatever it is that you're looking at. Of course, as with any College Board test, knowing a little bit about the test's design will make answering the questions a lot easier. So here's one thing to pay attention to. Every single passage on the literature test will include the date that it was written. Pay attention to that date. The further back in time the date is, the less likely it is that the passage means exactly what you think it means, because the meanings of words and phrases can shift over time. So if the passage is 400 years old, be prepared for the fact that it might not express things exactly the same way you would express them now. And take that into account when you try to figure out which answer choice restates the passage. You also need to be aware that the College Board uses the term metaphor in a way that's different from the way it's probably used in your English class. In English class, a metaphor is usually a type of comparison in which you state that something is something else. This is distinguished from a simile in which you compare two things using like or as. But on the subject test in literature, the word metaphor actually refers to any non-literal use of language. So on the SAT, any non-literal use of language, like for instance personification or anything like that, qualifies as metaphor. Be aware of this because the College Board likes to ask you questions about metaphor very often on this test. One other thing. When you're trying to analyze a poem, make sure that you remember to read each poem sentence by sentence rather than line by line. The unit of meaning in a poem, just like the unit of meaning in an essay or anything else written in the English language, is still the sentence. So read from period to period or from semicolon to period. And within each sentence, if you're not sure what the sentence says or what it's trying to communicate, begin by identifying the main verb within the sentence. Once you've identified the main verb, figure out what is doing that verb and what is receiving the action of that verb. From there, you'll probably find it a lot easier to understand the sentence as a whole, and once you understand most of the sentences within the poem, you'll be able to understand the poem itself. And actually, that leads me to one more final statement about this test. Just as we saw with the SAT-1 critical reading passages, it is not necessarily crucial that you understand every single thing about the passages that appear on the literature test. You only need to understand enough to answer each question. So, for instance, if a question asks you about something in a poem from lines 9 to 11, you don't need to understand what's going on in the poem around line 28. This is the same type of thing we saw with the SAT critical reading. Remember, it's important at all times to control your panic response. Just pay attention to the test, answer each question as it comes, and remember that it's ultimately pretty much the same thing as the SAT 1 critical reading, just with more challenging words here and there. Keep this stuff in mind while you're preparing for the literature subject test. And remember, if you run into any trouble or have any questions at all you need to do is head over to www.mysterytutorvault.com, register there if you're not already registered, and post your questions in the appropriate thread in the forums. I'll answer them myself. Thanks very much for watching, and remember, with the right strategies and my personal help over at mysterytutorvault.com, it's easier than you think.